lovely people. Welcome to another book chat wrap-up of things I have been reading recently.
Sophie vlogs.
I have quite a few non-fiction books in this one, I think. So I'm going to start with my fiction. Oh, half and half. Start with fiction, end on some non-fiction. Happy days. So, I'm going to start off by talking about Deadly Election by Lindsey Davis. This is the third book in the Flavia Alba Roman mystery series. It's by the same writer who did the Falco series. Flavia Alba is Falco's adopted daughter, and it's sort of following her as sort of like a detective in Domitian era Rome. I didn't get on very well with the first one of these books because I found it quite predictable. I am settling in a lot more as the series goes on. I'm finding it a little bit more engaging. I think so far the second one's still my favourite because there was a whole discussion about like Roman slaves and stuff like that, which I found like an interesting like moral discussion to be thinking about. This one follows Flavia as while there is an election going on and she's helping her friend to try and get his candidate elected to the Senate. They also, in her father's auction house, they find a recently decomposing body in this chest that they're trying to sell on auction. Flavia is investigating both of them. As so often happens in these things, it might be that there are some links between the two. I enjoyed this a lot. It was a good, fun murder mystery. There were enough clues so that you could piece it together, but unlike the first book, it took you a little bit longer to do that, which is always nice. They continue to be like light-hearted. The humour's not always my type of humour, but I am enjoying it a lot more than I used to. There's also there's a relationship developing that we could have spent a lot more of these books pulling that out, so it's kind of fun that that's actually happening now, because otherwise I think it might get a bit repetitious if it was to keep hinting that something might happen and then never happen. So all in all, enjoyed it, will be reading the next one, see how it keeps on. After that, I succeed in my goal that I set myself a while ago of finishing some of the series I've been reading. I read Tehanu by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is the fourth book in the Earthsea Quartet. This sort of loops back into the second book quite a lot, as well as picking up where the third book left off. I'm going to try and be vague to avoid some spoilers, but a character who's the main character in the second book is brought back into this one. It was very interesting with Ged to explore the ramifications of the end of the third book, which very much changed the situation for him and how he functions. Seeing that play out was interesting. This is very much more of because one of the main characters of this is a woman, and she's sort of looking after this small child who was suffered from a real act of brutality where the people who were supposed to be looking after her essentially like tried to burn her alive. There's a real focus on like women's experience in this, and also like in the society of Earthsea, how male wizards slash mages are treated versus how like women's approach to magic is treated. And I think there was a really interesting discussion there about there were a number of moments where our main character is attempting to interact with mages, and she's saying this stuff, and she can see that they do not get what she's saying. Even as they hear the words, even as they think that they are acknowledging the words, they are missing the fundamental point behind them. So that was like an interesting sort of like contrast, bearing in mind most of this has been we've been focused on the stories of like male mages and their journeys with magic and stuff. It was interesting to get like a contrast of that. I think I'm not wrong in thinking that there is another book in this series. I could be wrong, I need to research this. But I would be interested. I feel like there is an openness that I can see where I think a fifth book would go and what narrative line it would follow, and I'm intrigued by that because there were some revelations given in this which were very interesting. I also really enjoyed like dragons have become more of an element, and that was really fun. So yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin, just her books always have sort of like a quiet power to them. Like I always find them a really enjoyable read, and then they leave me with lots to think about, and I think that they're ones which you could go back to and read quite a lot and reread them, and you'd be able to pull new things from them. I keep saying every time I finish an Ursula K. Le Guin book that I want to go back and reread it, and I haven't reread any of them yet, but one day I will when the time is right. But yes, thoroughly enjoyable, a nice fun fantasy series which I would recommend both for younger readers. I think there's quite an accessible, especially the first book is quite accessible to younger readers, but also like I think there is a lot to be gained as an older reader, able to look at like what ideas are being portrayed to us here, what are sort of like ideas of balance and stuff like that. It's very cool. My final bit of fiction is a short story collection, which is Diving Bells by Lucy Wood. This is a collection of short stories that is all inspired by Cornish mythology, which is why I picked it up. On the whole, I did really enjoy this. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because I think I realised that I keep buying short story collections because they have really interesting concepts, but short stories are not like a thing that I don't always find them the easiest to have a real emotional connection to, partly because they are short. But this one, I think, was one of the better short story collections I've read. I enjoyed some of them more than others. There was a really interesting sort of openness to a lot of these. A lot of these sort of explore an interesting concept that you can tell is inspired by Cornish mythology, but a lot of the time you're not given too many answers. You're exploring a theme or a topic, and then it sort of ends and you're left to wonder what's happening after the continuation of the story and what are the repercussions of the story and stuff like that. My favourite one, which I turned the corner down of, is Beachcombing, which is all about this kid called Oscar and his relationship with his grandma, who lives in a cave on the beach, and they comb the beach and stuff like that. And it was just a really lovely, you have this backdrop of some mythology and stuff, but actually, like, at its heart, it's just about the kid's relationship with his grandmother and stuff, and I just thought that was a really, really lovely one. But yeah, I think there were a lot of really interesting concepts and stuff in this that I found really engaging. Sometimes I found it a bit harder to connect to certain stories, but as it got on, I think I got more into it, and I sort of embraced this like open style a bit more. So I wasn't seeking a resolution, I was just experiencing a concept given to me, which was interesting. On to my non-fiction. First of them is The Stately Homo, a celebration of the life of Quentin Crisp, edited by Paul Bailey. This is a series of, it's all about Quentin Crisp, who became famous for his book, which was turned into a film, called The Naked Civil Servant, because essentially he was a gay man, and he was essentially employed to be like an artist model, so like a live model, so he spent a lot of his time being paid by like councils to be naked, hence the name. This is sort of like a collection of writings. Some of it are writings about him by people who knew him. Some of it is excerpts from his own books interspersed with those. It was interesting to get a sense of who he is as a person. I'm interested in these people who were very openly, either, like in his case, openly gay in a time when you're not really, he suffered a lot of like police, not like always violence, but like he at one point, like 2 policemen tried to frame him for soliciting when he turned up in the court and was able to successfully argue, like, I'm so obviously openly gay, why would I solicit people in public? Like, I could never pretend to not be what I am, and he was acquitted for it. And there's that experience and that, like, what drives a person I find really interesting. My critique of this as a collection is I felt like this could have been more tightly edited. It's sprung up from a real love of the person by people who loved him in his life, and I get that. A lot of the people who are contributing to this sort of like covered the same ground, so as someone who's reading this to get a sense of who this person is, there were a lot of like moments from his life which were like iconic moments, but a lot of people talked about the same moments, which after a while gets a bit samey when you're reading like this in like a couple, I read it in a couple of days, so reading the same like moments done over and over again, like whilst they obviously had a big impact on people, does get a bit repetitious. Also, some of the excerpts of his book felt weird because it was like someone would describe that excerpt and then later I would read the excerpt. I don't know. I felt like some of the editing could have been better. That said, it did get a better idea of who he was as a person. It was interesting to read, and it's just, if you're someone who's interested in this, maybe bear in mind that this is a one that's better to like dip in and out of than do what I did, which was just like read it in like 3 days. After that is a book which was lent to me, which is Everywoman by Jess Phillips. This is sort of like, I've read a couple of books like this recently, which are sort of like part manifesto, but also like just part like memoir about someone's life. Generally, I quite like Jess Phillips. I'm not a Labour supporter, but I have no problem with her as a person. This was interesting in many ways. The most interesting parts of these, I think, were the ones which were a real insight, like into Westminster and into her experiences in Westminster and stuff, because there was a lot of stuff that was really interesting to learn about, and also her time working with like Women's Aid, stuff like that. That was really interesting. I think the title of this is maybe a little bit misleading because I read Everywoman and I think that this is supposed to be like generalizing. I don't know. Because of that aspect of it being part memoir, it is very personal to Jess Phillips, which makes it feel like this title feels a bit weird to me because it feels like she should be having this manifesto that's supposed to apply to all women, but also it's actually very personal and applies largely just to Jess Phillips' life because, like, for example, this focuses a lot on, like, lifting up women and stuff like that, but also it feels very... There are limitations to the outlook because it is created by one person. So, like, for example, this talks a lot about the type of woman that's talked about in this a lot is like, there's not much mention of like gay women or like bisexual women or stuff like this. Like, there are limitations here which I think maybe if it was titled something different I wouldn't have minded so much about because I would have expected more of a memoir, but I was expecting more of like a manifesto. Don't know if that makes sense. It's a very easy read. There is this like brand of like these feminist books which I think this falls under, where it's like it's quite a good, easy, accessible start point. I don't know entirely who this is focused to, because like some of the times I was reading it and the way it's written makes me think that it's aimed at a slightly younger person who maybe is like wanting to like begin learning about these topics, and then other times the types of things that were being discussed felt more suited to like an older, more mature person. So I don't know. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because I think objectively like it does what it sets out to do in some ways. I just wonder if maybe it's sort of, I don't know. I had some issues with it as a put together collection. I think it was maybe a little bit fragmented. After those two, which I have like mixed feelings of, we're going to end on a high, and that is Sophie Scholl and the White Rose by Annette Dunbach and Judd Newborn. This is all about Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, who were a resistance group in Germany during the Nazi occupation, and not the Nazi occupation, the Third Reich. This was really interesting. I have known about the White Rose before, but it was very interesting to get like a sense of the individual members and why they decided to they printed loads of leaflets and distributed them around Germany and stuff like this. They were like a dissenting voice against the Nazis and stuff like that. They were all unfortunately caught by the Nazis, interrogated, and they were executed. But like this sense of, it reminded me a lot of Last Words, which I think I talked about in my last book chat, which was about the Easter Rising in Ireland, and how both of these give you a real sense of like different people are coming to these movements for different reasons. Sometimes it's religious, sometimes it's moral, sometimes it's, you know, other things, but they all end up contributing to the same thing, but these differences helps them in, like, I don't know, it was just interesting to get a sense of like what drives these people, and then also just like, I don't know, I think this is really well put together. It reads in like a narrative way that really builds tension, so by the time it's all coming to an end you feel really tense, and it's a really easy, accessible way, I think, to learn about these people. I just thought it was really good. I'm waffling because I thought it was really good. Suffice to say, I think this is a really important thing to read about, and I think it's really important to remember these dissenting voices, because you know, you hear a lot about the resistance movements in like France and stuff like that, but like actually I think it is really good to remember that there were a lot of German people who did try and stand up against the Nazi regime, and in many cases were executed for it, and particularly Sophie Scholl, because she was so young, she was just 18, and she had such like poise during the public like trial and stuff like this. I think that's part of the reason why she's held up as this figure, because I watched what did I watch? Oh, I watched Der Untergang, which was all about the Hitler's bunker and stuff like that, and they at the end ended with the interview of the woman who was his secretary, and she said that her whole time she had always felt like she hadn't really done anything particularly bad, because she was just doing a job and someone else would have done the job anyway, and she wasn't actually like engaging in any of these atrocities. And then she found out about Sophie Scholl, who was executed when she was 18, and it made her realise that she could have done something else, and she could have been a dissenting voice and stuff like that, but she didn't. And I don't know, I think there's just something quite powerful about this story that is important to remember, and I think this was a really great narrative of getting that across to you. So yes, a slightly serious end to the video, but that's what I've been reading recently. As per usual, I'd really love to hear it if you have any thoughts on any of these. Do leave your comment down below if so. Otherwise, I hope you have a really nice day, and I will see you next week for something different.